First statement.
Okay. So my first statement and challenge to you, Pooven, is that until we address social issues, we're not likely to succeed on the environment.
So common sense suggests that actually any respect for the environment is built on valuing the stewards of that environment, not just those people who are keeping the forests, but actually every person who interacts with the planet just because they live. But we've always known this. So why has the S been so shortchanged since the dawn of CSR?
The big social NGOs have been around before the big environmental NGOs, but somehow we've got to a stage where the environmental issues have created more noise, let's say, and resonated somehow better. You see that very well. Let's use climate as the proxy for that, but we could use ecological biodiversity in nature. I don't think the world community has the ability to deal with more than 2 or 3 of these things. But we've got climate there, and it crowds out everything else, to the point that I think that it is holding back progress. If we take climate then as an example, there's 2 aspects to where social comes in. One is poverty and one is inequality. And on poverty, of course, that sustainability costs money. If we're honest, if you want to take slavery out of your supply chains, you're suddenly going to have to start paying for people. So costs of goods are going to go up unless, of course, you can find savings somewhere else in the system. But if you go around the local shops where I live, clearly the sustainable products cost more, or those that are branded and claimed as sustainable cost more, and therefore, if you've got the money, you can pay for them. If you don't have the money, you can't. Clearly, if we're going to have if prosperity and wellness and well-being is the overall aim that we want out of society, we're going to have to reduce that demand in some place in order to allow demand and well-being to increase in others. And therefore, unless we address those societal issues of poverty and inequality, we're not going to effectively address the environmental things.
That link between climate and society is about climate justice, and the connection between human rights and the right to development. The question about connection is, do businesses think they have a larger role in society and for the planet, beyond just ensuring their factories and operations are safe, or that workers are kept happy enough not to strike? And what about the complete disconnect, like saving the giant sequoias from California wildfires? That is literally about saving some trees while the rest of the US is burning from climate change. I mean, how do we put these things together?
A couple of observations come to mind is that companies, when they set out their stall, they can do this. If you look at safety, the way that companies address safety, they've gone after it single-mindedly determined to eliminate all accidents and injuries. And there's never any discussion of the cost of that. So companies can achieve big things on the social side when they want. They can afford that. But how do you make this inclusive for everyone? How do you make sure that no one's going to lose through this?
Right. Well,
and so the citizens get this at the lower level. It's just that I don't think there's a true understanding at the corporate level of what it means.
The industrial age has a lot to answer for. I mean, most egregiously, that companies are practically entitled to impunity under the law. Consider safety. It's not because there are a lot of voluntary standards out there suggesting that companies should do the right thing, and make workplaces safe. It's, if you don't do this, you're liable. So the risk and legal teams make sure that your workplace is safe. Justifying compliance is a no-brainer. The problem with sustainability is the crutch of voluntary standards. Please be better, a better company, and do this for the sake of the planet. But where's the reinforcing incentive in trade policy, in economic policy?
I think there's been a shift, hasn't there, over more than a 20-year period, that the companies, the corporate sector, can solve this sustainability thing. They can to an extent, but I think we ran out of room about 3 or 4 years ago on that, and it's pretty clear now that governments have got to start playing their role in a way that they've been absent for some time.
On that note, let's go to your second point.
To my second statement, which is that despite the rhetoric, I see little pressure for companies to directly address poverty in their value chains.
And that is the duty of governments. As we've seen during COVID, many governments outsourced accountability to companies and sat back as just another stakeholder in the pandemic, but forced labor in rubber glove factories, profiteering by vaccine manufacturers, richer countries hoarding and wasting vaccines that just expire. COVID reminded governments that they are elected to be in charge. On the other hand, why would a company do anything unless there is a legal pressure or compulsion for them to act? Is there any value for a company to address poverty? If there is neither pressure nor value, honestly, why would the company even bother to have rhetoric?
Two things that I think are worth saying. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development has recently put out a decent report on inequality. Their conclusion out of that is that inequality is basically a systemic issue. And that could be right. Climate change is a systemic issue for all of us. And yet you can actually identify then that climate change is a particular issue for a particular company. But the moment that you, and the same for inequality, I suppose, but the moment you position this as a systemic issue, you're dependent upon the system to deal with this, which means that you're pointing at everyone else, looking at who's going to do it. That government should step in. The companies should act en masse, and that's just then, I think, a recipe for delay. And then the second thing I would say is that, and this is where, and there's a lot of criticism at the moment for ESG, but I think we have to understand where the value of ESG is. So if you look at from a sustainability point of view, company X may well, through its operations, be having a negative impact upon climate change, be having a negative impact upon poverty and inequality through its sourcing policies. If you look at that through an ESG lens, you look at it the other way, because you say, what's the impact of climate change upon the company? Or what's the impact of poverty and inequality upon the company? And in this particular case, clearly, climate change is going to be negative for most companies. They can actually quantify that in terms of the amount of money that they will have to, that will impact upon their sourcing and their value chains, their infrastructure. But poverty and inequality is actually positive for a company. It lowers the costs of production. Yeah. So it's completely different. So where's the incentive? So you say the rhetoric, yeah, and that's why I say there is a bit of rhetoric. Yeah, let's do a few nice projects. But actually, to solve that is going to change the value chain so dramatically in many places that it questions, the economic model of, and this is to capitalism as well. I don't want to pick on any one particular company, because the capital is built on that, and we'll come on to that in a moment, I'm sure.
Capitalism, the value chain. Now, these are the foundation. It's the context for a business strategy for continuity. assuming that the global business goal is growth. A Japanese company may plan growth over 100 years within a fixed operating environment of morals, values, society, respect. So there's a standard for end outcomes, having a better society, better environment, etc. Whereas, let's say, a pure capitalist may instead take a Feynman type approach of assuming that consumers will behave in any way they can. So our business must be ready to react if they want to grow in ever-changing market morality. So our goal is readiness for change. Okay, consider then the last 3 years. Both the end outcome model and the readiness to change model for growth are slammed. Whether it's the airline industry or tourism or the disease vector sector, history has no reference points. So how people look at business strategy, continuity, and therefore sustainability moving forward will be interesting. What's your last point?
So my last point is can we tackle social issues in sustainability without discussing capitalism and colonialism?
So building on the previous question and building on this point, are we saying that social injustice and the need for companies to want to keep things a particular way because it's very cost efficient, is this baked deeply into our economic system?
Yes. Short answer. Slightly longer answer is that, so one particular example, Cadbury's came from 120 years ago, doing fantastic things in Bourneville with its factory, building the village and the workers' houses and all the infrastructure and social, looking after their workers, part of the whole Quaker approach to business. I think it was in the late 1890s that they were being criticized in the press. You can find this all online now. They were being criticized in the press because at the same time they were doing all this fantastic stuff in England, they were buying cocoa from slavery and slave plantations in Sao Tome. And it took them then 9 years to persuade the rest of the industry to change that model. And they did it by shifting their sourcing to Ghana. So you go to Ghana today and there might not be too much slavery visible or even present. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. There's child labor there, that's for sure. But how much? So this is not what I'm saying. Is this is not a new issue. And if you go back even longer, and a slightly even longer answer to that is that capitalism arose at the time of the Enlightenment and philosophical thought that for the first time in history separated the notion of man and nature, humans and nature. Which was all very convenient because it allowed then capitalism to grow by exploiting individuals and nature, and that was through slavery, it was through colonialism, it was through trashing the environment, and that's where we're at. And I don't talk about the Anthropocene. There's this idea that we're in the Anthropocene. No, we're not. We're in the Capitalocene.
Yeah.
Humans have lived on the planet for hundreds of thousands, arguably millions of years. It's only in the last 200 or 300, and even the last 50, let's say, that capitalism has really got ahead of itself, and it relies upon growth, and it relies upon profit and productivity. And the only way it can continue growing and continue driving productivity is by extracting value from nature, which it doesn't pay for, or people from which it does. And yeah, that's I think I think where we get to and it will always be that way, whilst ever we think that progress is growth from the point of view of income, rather than growth as prosperity of well-being and health. And whilst ever we're not costing into the cost of goods the externalities, and not having a proper balance of power between labor and capital.
So even the terminology externality obviously suggests that it's not an internal consideration. It is something outside of our system.
Yes.
You know, I always found that to be very interesting. You know, an externality is the climate. Is it
well, indeed, it's actually saying, you know, where humans will do this, and there's the climate and externalities over there. It's no
doubt we as a species have diverged from symbiosis with the planet. I think we've done so because we have effective medicine, we have better development, greater longevity, but we have destructive living patterns. There are just more of us living longer and consuming more. Our resourcefulness is our resource curse. We are a wunderkind species inventing materiality, but we don't know how to reuse or recycle the toys that we've played with for 300 years. Those factories billowing smoke, the very crux of capitalism, are still being built. So colonialism, slavery, coal and oil, these are all technologies of that past. I mean, sure, we have some new technologies which may not be as bad. But if they are as bad, we need to be quicker in understanding the consequences and having the confidence to change. The real innovation is, I think, the ability to let go. The real problem is those guys who cannot or will not let go.
Indeed, because it comes back to what I said before, that the top 10% are consuming 50%. And so how do we're not going to wind the clock back, but how do we change from seeing progress in terms of money to progress in terms of well-being?
Right.
You know, people are not a lot happier. I mean, the curve flattens once you get above $25,000 US per capita. So the curve flattens in terms of happiness and well-being and health and all of those things that actually, when you ask people what they value, is important. And so we're going to have to find some way of rebalancing that. Bringing it back to the corporate world, there's going to be three types of companies, or there are three types of companies. Those companies that will look the same tomorrow that they did today. They've had to adjust properly, they've got more efficient, this and that. There's another group of food companies might be one example of that, because we're all going to need food. There's a second group of companies that they will have to change really rather dramatically. You could foresee car companies in the future actually, being companies that drive social mobility and public transport, and the number of cars that are then allowed on the road or needed on the road would be a fraction of what they are today. So they'd still exist, but they'd be really rather different and then there's those companies that won't exist because they're not needed. Things like, private jets or advertising. Right. Some people are going to have to be retrained. We've relied a little bit too much on companies in the past to get us out of this. Companies have a role, but so do governments. And we really need, I think, at this point, governments to step in and nudge us in the right direction.
It could be a dawn of the new era for governments. They may have to stop fighting each other and sending arms to each other.
And if you look at the arc of history, then it points out certain things which put into perspective where we are today and why we are today, and the notion that actually we can change things.
Right.
And things probably will change.